Hello, everyone. So today we'll get into the final aspect of society during the Enlightenment. Talk about religion. We haven't talked about religion quite a bit since the Protestant Reformation. So let's kind of see hey, what's going on? All right. So a lot of this came to this whole idea of church versus state, which is a common type of theme here. Now, the church still exercises quite a bit of power in Spain, Portugal, France, Italy, Austria, and Poland, and still controls large amounts of land and wealth, okay? But we're starting to have more and more issues with the structure of it. Bishops and cardinals would often get extremely amounts of money, large amounts of money. Regular priest wouldn't. And even some people within this structure don't like it. And then in the Protestant nations, they're trying to figure out, well, how can we structure it differently? And then even leaders in Catholic nations are still starting to have issues with some of these guys at the top. And so, what states are going to start to try to do is increase their power even more. Okay. Again, the issue that they had with it was that the church often had states within states in many countries. And for instance, many of these are actually run by the Jesuits. Okay. And so the Jesuits kind of had their own little states, and then they had lots of political influence as well. And so, what ends up happening, and this is just to give an idea of how people would get greater power. National governments start to make moves specifically against the Jesuit orders. Not to say to the degree that they did when they tried to, when they blew up the Templars in the 1300s, but not too different. For instance, in Paraguay, there was a Jesuit-run state that was there, and Portugal destroys the state. They expel all of them from their country, and they seize all Jesuit property. The French and the Spanish do the same thing. The Spanish actually just expel the Jesuits from all of their colonies. And then finally, as a result, Pope Clement XIV, while trying to control some type of power that he has, will dissolve the order entirely. And what we see here is overall papal power, again, declining quickly, now even in the Catholic nations. And then most leaders begin to just appoint the high church officials themselves. We're back to simony. And again, the Catholic Church is really just continuing to go down in influence. The other thing that starts to crop up here is this idea of tolerance, which of course was a huge idea for the philosophies. And early in the 1700s, they start speaking out against, religious fanaticism and that toleration is the way to go. However, the norms are rulers like Louis XIV, who took away all of the rights of the Huguenots. In France, they were still burning heretics until 1781. And the norm was not religious toleration. But then, Joseph II, this guy is just a trailblazer here, of Austria, is going to pass the Toleration Patent of 1781. Now, what we're going to have here is that Catholicism is still recognized as the number one religion, but all other religious groups now have equal rights of non-Catholics. They're able to buy houses, property, practice as craftsmen, take up academic appointments, they can be in public service, and they're not required to take any oaths that would be contrary to their religions. And basically, up to this point, in most nations that were really, really Catholic, like Austria, Catholics were forbidden to have a variety of different jobs. And basically, what Joseph II of Austria is ending that. He is still saying that Catholicism is the preferred religion, but if you're not Catholic, it basically means you have the ability to function freely just as any other Catholic would. And that's a huge deal. And which can definitely help in Austria, being that there's such this multi-ethnic empire, to do what they can to keep things relatively calm is really important. Now, unfortunately for the Jewish community, however, that's not going to be nearly as good. They are the most persecuted group in Europe religiously, except Poland is actually pretty tolerant, and that's why many Jews will move to Poland at this time. Most places, they are forbidden from holding a number of jobs and often have to pay additional taxes. And they regularly have to deal with pogroms. And this is when Jewish communities would be subject to attacks where people are killed and homes are looted. For instance, on the left is an aftermath. You see a variety of people who have been killed in a pogrom in Russia in 1904. And Russia was really one of the places where this would be big time. Actually, let me, yeah. And interestingly enough, a lot of philosophies aren't necessarily in favor of them. Some will write for tolerance, but many of them play up stereotypes and hatreds of Jews that we've talked about at a variety of times this year, some of which still exist today. And so overall for Jews, not a lot of success. There is one group that's going to be very interesting here, the Sephardic Jews. The Sephardic Jews were the Jews who were expelled from Spain starting in 1492 under Ferdinand and Isabella, and they moved to places like Turkey, Amsterdam, Venice, London, and Frankfurt. They are relatively free to engage in commerce and banking, and some will even have enough success that they will work directly for rulers in German states. And so some Jews, actually, as you can see, the resettlement areas will find ways to have success, particularly, again, the Sephardic Jews, the ones that came from Spain, okay? And so commerce and banking, they're going to be relatively successful there, but still some of those hatreds are going to be around. Okay, and finally, once again, Joseph II, one of the few rulers who will address this, Joseph II will remove taxes and gave them more opportunity for movement and jobs, but they still couldn't worship in the open or own land. So basically what worshiping in the open means is that they can't be outwardly Jewish. And if they had synagogues, they were relatively small, not decorative, and not attention grabbing, if you will. And so it's pretty rough. Now, Catholicism is still going to be around during the Enlightenment. It's not going to go anywhere. Catholics, you still have parish churches that are incredibly important in many communities. We still have mass and religious ceremonies to keep the population united, and we'll really focus on prayers to saints, pilgrims, and the veneration of Mary, as you see this picture here. And so it's still going to be very large with the common people, okay? Yes, the political structure and the power that the Catholic Church once wielded was gone. Still, socially, they have still tremendous amounts of impact. There are still millions of Catholics in Europe, and we're still going to talk about issues between them and some of the Protestants as we move forward. And there's also a big kind of new move here in the development of pietism. The whole idea is to being and having a rational look at religion. And deism, which I've briefly talked about before, is really on the rise here. And the whole idea with deism is belief in a God, but not necessarily a structured religion. And the whole idea of pietism is that people were looking for a deeper and more personalized relationship with God. And this starts to get really popular in the 1600s. And the guy that was kind of the biggest advocate was Count Nicholas von Zinzendorf, who is from Moravia. That actually is modern day part of Czechoslovakia today. And the whole idea is the emphasis on piety and strict adherence to the Word of God. But you also want to show that in your day-to-day life, okay? And that it's important that you use the ideas in the Bible to govern your life. And the idea is that you need to experience your religion. You need to go to holy places. You need to continue to pray deeply and find a way to bring, again, the Word of God in your everyday life. And that's really, really crucial here. And pietism in different forms of it, whether it's like evangelicalism and stuff like that, this is something that we see here with the craziness of the Reformation is people are looking for a way to kind of get back to some of the basics and really just developing a relationship with God, not necessarily focusing on the religious structure so much. But a new religion, if you will, that developed is Methodism, which is developed by John Wesley and many of his friends as well, who was an ordained Anglican minister. So that's kind of his background. And again, just like many other religious leaders do, he went through a bit of a spiritual crisis. He was doubting his faith, and he was always vague on this, but eventually has a mystical experience with God. Maybe it was a vision, something along that line. But what he decides to do is to become a traveling missionary, bringing, in their words, quote, glad tidings of the word of God. He actually, he's from England, and eventually at one point he will end up in Georgia. So that gives you an idea of like how far this guy's willing to travel. And the key ideas here is that all people can be saved by God if they accept his grace and experience him. And the whole idea of being born again into the faith. This is where we have the idea of born again Christians. And the whole focus is that Jesus died for all people, thus all people can be saved through him. And so a lot of people who might have had issues with church structures or religious structures, that, Methodism was a place that they could go. They're really big on charitable works as well as cooperative communities, kind of like early socialism, which we will talk about later. They're very big all up in England. He continues to try to spread it. And if you look here on the left, if you just look at the sheer amount of people, in 1780, there's like no Methodists in the world. And then boom, if we look, see how much larger that they will grow in just sheer volume, it's pretty impressive. And the Methodists will be very successful in the New World, as well as much of England and other parts of it. It will split from the Anglican Church, and so there's still a lot of ideas of Anglicanism that are in Methodism, but the idea is focusing again on that relationship with God, and focusing on accepting Jesus and the idea of accepting his beliefs and focusing kind of on the positivity of that. Okay, so we see, so religion hasn't gone away. The chaos, if you will, of the Reformation is calming down a bit, but religion will still grow. And if you always look to all the way today, is that religion is still such a vital part of modern day Europe, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. All right, so that's our last video on the Enlightenment. Hope you guys enjoyed them, and we'll move on to our next period soon.